Hello! Today I'm continuing my look at the unique setting of Ivalice within the Final Fantasy series, with a discussion on the final numerical instalment to feature on the PlayStation 2, Final Fantasy XII. Now, Final Fantasy XII is another of these interesting and initially quite contentiously received instalments to the series, and it's only through the passage of time that, perhaps like a fine wine, it has matured and gradually become a much more reputable title to the many, rather than the few. In this episode, I'm going to proceed to discuss Final Fantasy XII and its innovative approach in terms of gameplay and progression, its continuity of the unique Ivalice setting, which I last explored in my Final Fantasy Tactics review, and its striking story and characters, which returned to the ensemble roots and medieval setting for which Final Fantasy games were first renowned. So, to begin this discourse with a little bit of context around the release and the initial reception of Final Fantasy XII, I think back in 2006 it suffered from the expectations set by Square's own marketing team. In the wake of the comparatively linear Final Fantasy X and the questionably numerical MMO Final Fantasy XI, many fans were beginning to question the trajectory of the series in its increasing departure from traditional JRPG conventions. In response to this, series veterans and Square's marketing repeatedly claimed that 12 would be a return to the narrative-driven golden age of Final Fantasy past, which naturally stirred up expectations among fans that perhaps we'd see a return to a brooding protagonist, some form of existential dilemma going on, and a traditional turn-based combat system. So, when a distinctly modern twist to the JRPG genre, and the heavily marketed upbeat hero of Vayne materialised, many were mildly put out by this apparent contradiction from the folks at Square, and the universal acclaim attributed by Famitsu, IGN, and other media outlets only compounded this early frustration and sense of betrayal that many felt at having been sold the idea of a more nostalgic throwback Final Fantasy game. Now, for my part, I wouldn't say I was outraged or dismissive of the title in 2006, and I do in fact think that Final Fantasy XII is an excellent and highly ambitious game, if a little dialogue heavy in the build-up to the action compared to earlier titles, which see us thrust immediately into kidnapping princesses or cities getting destroyed by Sin or Sector 7 bombings, for example. But at the same time, I could on some level appreciate the attitudes of legacy fans who'd been sold the idea of nostalgia, only to be presented with an irrevocable push towards the future, and additional warning signs such as director and Ivalice creator Yasumi Matsuno stepping down during development, and series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi subsequently stating that he wouldn't play the game. This somewhat tainted opinions and left an ultimately unfounded perception that the game was doomed to fail. On this note, to be honest, I can't think of a single Final Fantasy game that doesn't suffer at least some form of contempt or disregard upon its initial release, from some sections of the fanbase. So, let's fast forward to today, and considering Final Fantasy XII as a standalone entry to the series, in a vacuum, rather than in the wake of such dodgy marketing, I think it succeeds and upholds the idea of Final Fantasy, and particularly an Ivalice game, in numerous ways, which I'll delve into directly. Firstly, and as I discussed in my Final Fantasy Tactics episode, Final Fantasy XII upholds the unique art direction and character designs of Akihiko Yoshida, whose sandy sepia tones instill a beautiful sense of the arcane and a Western folkloric fantasy that sets Ivalice apart from the remaining titles, I think. And though attention to art design may seem superficial, this aesthetic and continuity across Tactics, Vagrant Story and 12 is something that I really quite enjoy and appreciate, and the tan complexions of Vayne and Balthier slot neatly into the environments such as Rabanastra and Arcades, and the other sprawling world map locations such as the Yensa Sand Sea, for example. And it's this sense of cohesion between character and environment, and also the characters across these sprawling games, Vagrant Story, Tactics, etc., that I think really compounds the idea of Ivalice. And on the note of aesthetic and the medieval slant of Final Fantasy XII, it also takes a step further, as it's one of the few games to employ a serif typeface for its dialogue and its text boxes, which is very modern for the time, as there's always been a popular idea that serif fonts look terrible on digital displays. But it also sets it apart from earlier Final Fantasy games, which had very boxy dialogue boxes with, simple sans serif digital typing, whereas 12 took a step further, and where its characters talk in this archaic theatrical Shakespearean dialogue, the way that the dialogue and text appears on the screen is also very, archaic and Romanesque, which is just a simple addition that I quite liked as well. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly in terms of narrative, the game continues along the same lines as Tactics, with a uniquely human storyline hinging around political strife, class, privilege versus poverty, and oppressive imperialism versus self-determinism. And once again, this distinguishes the game and the themes explored within the Ivalice series, because rather than contending with some profound supernatural menace from the get-go, we are dealing with human power struggles, duplicitousness and civil strife, rather than, for example, Genova aliens, sorceresses, and giant whale creatures called Sin. Like Tactics, Final Fantasy XII also operates in a profoundly moral grey area, and although Vayne Solidor doesn't often make his way into the best Final Fantasy villain discussions, he's a very interesting character with regards to his intentions, morals, and dubious status as a legitimately evil character, which I'll delve into later on. Now, of course, despite the thematic focus on human problems, both Tactics and Final Fantasy XII culminate with a supernatural reveal in the form of the Lucavi demons and the Ikuria, respectively. And on this note, the lore and consistencies between the two games has been questioned, as the Ikuria don't feature in Tactics and vice versa. However, generally speaking, 12 is said to occur a few centuries prior to the events of Tactics, and following the later events of Tactics we have Vagrant Story. So that's the loose chronology of the Ivalice games. And in the intervening years between 12 and Tactics, the Ikuria gods are said to have left the worlds of men, and due to some sort of cataclysm, many of the disparate races, tribes, and even countries that feature in 12 get rubbed from the face of the earth, which accounts for the considerably different societal landscape we find in Final Fantasy Tactics. But as I've already said, it's the aesthetic continuity that genuinely ties these games together, in my opinion anyway. So, while we're on the subject of comparing these two games, I'd also like to highlight some factors that make Final Fantasy XII more deserving of a numerical instalment, in my opinion. Firstly, there's the obvious discrepancy in gameplay mechanics that make Tactics deservedly divorced from the numerical instalments. But more importantly, I think, is that where Tactics operates in a brutal, distrustful narrative framework, wherein characters lie, cheat, and kill one another relentlessly, so that Ramza, our hero, can only really rely on himself most of the time. And this setting is compounded by the fact that your party consists of hired mercenaries rather than friends. 12, on the other hand, follows the more conventional power of friendship formula for which most Final Fantasy games are renowned, and Vaan, Bash, Balthier and Ashe all coalesce and combine to rely on one another and work through their individual issues and arcs. This more wistful fellowship type of story sits firmly within the numerical game framework. They harken back to this Tolkien-esque folkloric fantasy genre, where different cultures combine against a common foe. So in my opinion, that makes it worthy of a numerical designation, whereas Tactics is ostensibly, something that sits very much alone, due to its gameplay and its story dynamics. So talking about this fellowship idea, and while I'm on the subject of theme and setting, it's also interesting to note the homage that Final Fantasy games usually pay to the Star Wars franchise, most commonly through the recurring characters of Biggs and Wedge, who are named after two X-Wing pilots who feature in Star Wars A New Hope. However, when Final Fantasy XII was first released, many fans felt that this homage had been dialed up to 11, and numerous factors, from the sandy hues of the sprawling Rabanastre Plains, which resemble Luke Skywalker's home of Tatooine, to the imperialism versus freedom fighters overtones of the main story, and the range of the strange aliens and races that we encounter. Many said that these aren't too dissimilar from things that we see in the Star Wars universe. Indeed, Vaan, our hero, being an aspirational, poverty-stricken kid working for the money-driven banger Miguelo, does run some parallels with Anakin Skywalker working for Watto in Star Wars Phantom Menace. And furthermore, the opening FMV of Final Fantasy XII features scenes that resemble both the Star Wars space battle, which is the war that takes place, and also the wedding of Princess Ashe, which resembles the celebration scenes seen at the end of Phantom Menace, for example. And some people have gone even further with these Star Wars analogues and argue that Vaan runs parallels with Luke Skywalker, Princess Ashe runs parallels with Princess Leia, and Balthier and Fran run parallels with Han Solo and Chewbacca, respectively. And there's certain things such as Ashe being displaced as a princess and Balthier being a sarcastic sky pirate with a non-human companion. So, I think that's an interesting observation that people have made in the past. But it's prudent to note that Square have denied these Star Wars rumours and have attributed the plot and the setting inspiration to Akira Kurosawa's 1958 film The Hidden Fortress. But one thing that's very interesting to note about this is that The Hidden Fortress is a movie that did inspire George Lucas, particularly with his storyline for The Phantom Menace. So it's just another one of these interesting cyclical loops of influence and inspiration that tends to go on across certain media types. And particularly we see it in Final Fantasy with Star Wars, Studio Ghibli and Lord of the Rings, which I think loop in their inspiration throughout the Final Fantasy games. Now, moving on with the setting and the opening gambit of this sprawling Ivalice story, Final Fantasy XII returns to a narrative convention that has been absent for a while in Final Fantasy, which is that of having an opening prologue. Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, and partially Final Fantasy X were revelatory for jumping in at the deep end and throwing the player into the flux of some exciting action or event. Such as the reactor bombing, the seed exam, the kidnapping of Princess Garnet. And what they did is they threw us into these strange ambiguous scenarios and basically let the players figure out the world and the setting, as they went along. Like earlier titles, such as Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII relies on a prologue to set the scene, which is delivered through the voiceover of Marquis Helim Ondor, who is a character that we see in the game, and basically he onboards the player with some background information on the geopolitical events and setting. Now, generally speaking, the art of showing and not telling is considered more valued and more cultivated as a narrative device, as it embeds the audience in the story and provides a more immersive and organic experience of discovering a fictional world. And you're right there with the characters such as Cloud Strife or Squall Leonhart, trying to figure out these tense and unclear scenarios until the wider context is revealed to you. By comparison, the act of voiceover and prologue is a much more fairy tale-esque way of telling a story along the lines of, the Once Upon a Time format. In the instance of Final Fantasy XII, we literally have a storybook opening at the beginning of the game, reading out this setting and political event to us, which some would argue is a less immersive plot device and more detaching for the player. But on the other hand, rather than controlling a hero outsider who discovers the world alongside the player, Final Fantasy XII sees us control characters who are familiar with the Empire and they're familiar with the war and the oppression of the people. And so to frame these events with a prologue is somewhat necessary to onboard and educate the player with the political and societal context, which, again, some literary types would regard as poor storytelling and front-loading too much information, but others, including myself, don't mind so much if it's done sparingly and eloquently. Just looping back to Final Fantasy X as a comparative example of voiceover being done somewhat tactlessly, or at the very least randomly, is right at the beginning of the game when we're running past a billboard of Jecht in Zanarkand, and a Blitzball commentator called Zanar randomly pipes up in a solitary voiceover segment describing the disappearance of Jecht, which, to this day, I kind of liked it, but at the same time, it does feel really misplaced and quite strange to have at that particular interval in the game, particularly as Zanar or the voiceover isn't returned to or referenced ever again throughout the entire events of Final Fantasy X. So, moving on, I'll pick up on the story and the setting again later when we get to the characters of Final Fantasy XII, but next I'd like to remark upon the gameplay quite briefly, which is an equally contentious element of Final Fantasy XII, which has been given both praise and contempt depending on what kind of fan you are and what kind of elements of Final Fantasy that you're generally drawn to. Now, among the most prevalent criticisms levelled at Final Fantasy XII's gameplay over the years is an argument that it plays out like an MMO, and by this it seems people mean the overworld, traversability and camera angles, combined with a real-time battle system that, rather than having the traditional random encounter turn-based combat screen, sees players able to freely move around with enemies that are generated seamlessly into the overworld, rather than transitioning to a separate interface. Whether or not this MMO proposition had any substance is debatable, but it's worth noting that Final Fantasy XII was initially developed alongside Square's Play Online development team, who also worked on the MMO Final Fantasy XI, and it's well known that Square has always been interested in pushing technology, and particularly the potential of online products, since they first became viable. For my part, and considering whether this quote marks MMO gameplay style adds or detracts from the game, I would argue that, even as an enthusiast of the more traditional PS1 games, it didn't weigh on me too much one way or another. I think the only potential impact it had was on making the wider game more laborious than had traditionally been the case, because in earlier titles, where random encounters were used to create complex grinding scenarios in certain locations, Final Fantasy XII's game mechanics negated this by allowing the player to flee or evade visible enemies on the map. So what they opted to do as a workaround to maintain, and I think probably increase, the challenging aspect of the game, was introduce a larger number of dungeon crawls and linear, inescapable map areas for the player to contend with, which, again, is arguably reminiscent of mission-based MMO gameplay. But more importantly, I think, it replaces random encounters as a means of challenge and staggering this complexity as the game progresses in certain locations. On top of the renovated and seamless world map battle system, the original release of Final Fantasy XII has the introduction of the license board and Gambit system as an innovative approach to levelling and gameplay design. And despite this huge departure from JRPG convention, I have tended to find more positive reactions to this rather than negative, generally speaking. And for my part, it was also something I was quite receptive to when the game was first released. So, starting with the licensing board, Final Fantasy has usually sought to ground its battle ability and levelling mechanics in some plausible in-game context. For example, materia in Final Fantasy VII is crystallised Mako imbued with certain characteristics that can be slotted into specific weapons and accessories. Junctioning in Final Fantasy VIII is the channeling of paramagic via Guardian Forces, and abilities in Final Fantasy IX are based on the traditional Final Fantasy job classes, which owes to each character's strengths and characteristics, such as Zidane being a thief and Garnet being a summoner. In Final Fantasy XII, the licenses could be considered a contextual glimpse into the authoritarian and bureaucratic regime of Arcadia, which actively monitors the comings and goings and actions of its citizens, as seen in Vaan's opening quest around exiting and re-entering Rabanastre. Licenses, by their nature, are an official document showing someone's right to own, use, or undertake something, such as driving or selling alcohol, and there's a very governmental, political aspect to this system, which, as previously discussed, the Ivalice games hinge around heavily in lore and setting. However, despite this relatively innovative aspect to the game, which I think many others quite enjoyed, and for the first time permitted true freedom of character builds, the license board was later replaced in the Zodiac Age re-release, and it was replaced and reverted back to a more traditional job-based levelling system, which channeled characters towards a specific skill set and, set of attributes. Which again, doesn't bother me too much, but I struggle to see why the license board warranted replacing, as it was quite an interesting innovation, to the game, in my opinion. Moving on to Gambits, these are another innovative aspect of the gameplay, and the media latched onto this upon Final Fantasy XII's initial release, calling it the game that you could watch instead of play, owing to the automation of the Gambit system, which complemented the real-time battle mechanics. Now, the Gambit system is something I liked, but was much easier said than done when it came right down to it. It's quite easy to slip into the trap of having your entire party heal itself or heal one another at the same time, or accidentally cast Blizzard on an enemy that's healed by Blizzard, and a myriad of other goofs that see you performing subpar if you don't set up your Gambits properly. So the Gambit system could absolutely benefit and streamline gameplay, but it took some strategic thinking to optimise on a party-by-party and a battle-by-battle basis to fully prove an asset and automatic aspect of your gameplay. But for my part, I really liked it, but I never achieved an expertise in utilising it beyond the standard attacking and healing fundamentals. But I absolutely see the benefit of it in a game that took a dramatic step away from turn-based traditional JRPG gaming and required a more instantaneous and responsive means of playing. So, to conclude on the fundamentals of gameplay, Final Fantasy XII was an ambitious, challenging and profoundly different source of Final Fantasy upon its release, and it divided players, but was largely accepted for the freedom it gave, I think. The Zodiac Age dialed back on these innovative aspects to some degree, and made the game considerably easier and more accessible to those that required it, which, frankly, I do consider myself one of those. Now, I'd like to move on to the themes and story of Final Fantasy XII, and as mentioned, there's a distinct political edge and ideological conundrum that's explored in this game, along the ideas of free will versus predeterminism and the idea of fate. As such, much like Final Fantasy Tactics, there's multiple dialogues, vested interests and ulterior motives, which take attention away from any one core character and place focus on the power struggle between ideologies rather than one character's journey. So this contrasts starkly with Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy X, which clearly hinge around a single character's development within a wider story, and many detractors of Final Fantasy XII disliked it because there was no clearly defined hero arc, with Vaan in particular being targeted for his perceived irrelevance to the story, which I'll discuss shortly. But for my part, I think we have to consider this game firstly as a game that sits alongside Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy IX in its commitment to the collective ensemble cast, rather than any one character. And secondly, we have to consider it as an Ivalice game, in which the macro events and political turbulence demands precedence over things like romance and intricate isolated story arcs to one individual. So, on the surface, we have what appears to be an evil empire contending with a band of freedom fighters, which is quite a conventional good versus bad Star Wars-esque storyline, and for the most part sets the scene quite convincingly. The political framework we operate in is quite interesting and draws heavily on traditional notions of dynastic monarchies, particularly those found in medieval Europe, but also ideas of republicanism, particularly those found in ancient Rome. And these two political ideologies are embodied by Dalmasca on the one hand and Arcadia on the other, which essentially conflict and inform aspects of the game and its surface level political struggle. So Dalmasca is quite straightforward as a kingdom, and its misfortune at being a geographical flashpoint between the two warring empires of Rosaria and Arcadia are what draw it into the geopolitical conflict of the time, much like the island of Malta in World War II, which was of huge strategic importance to both sides. The Empire of Arcadia, however, is a really interesting glimpse into a bureaucratic pseudo-republican system that mimics the events of ancient Rome following the rise of Julius Caesar. Indeed, Vayne Solidor's rank within the elected Senate is that of consul, which is the same terminology used in ancient Rome for the cyclical leader of the Senate. And similar to the Roman Senate, which comprised entirely of nobles, Vayne, much like his father before him, gradually siphons power from them onto himself, to the extent that they are basically a mere formality rather than a representative arm of the Arcadian government. Again, similar to the effects of Caesar during his reign as consul and the gradual fall of the Republic. Within the Arcadian political system, we also have the armour-clad, visually striking judges, who are analogous to the generals and particularly the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome. And much like the ancient generals, the judges essentially work as warrior bureaucrats and politicians. They exercise free reign and immense power, providing that they answer to the Senate and work to impose empirical expansion. And to this day, Roman generals such as Pompey, Sulla, Mark Antony and Caesar are known to us due to their profound feats in both war and politics that makes ancient Rome the intrigue of historical study that it still is today. Final Fantasy XII adapts these elements effectively into the world of Ivalice, and in numerous cutscenes we see judges plotting betrayals or righteous manoeuvres towards their chosen masters. And once again, it's an excellent display of Matsuno's Ivalice games and how characters and factions can't simply be halved into categories of good and bad, but rather each have their own ideals and intentions that often conflict with their official allegiances, with Judge Zargabath and Judge Drace being excellent examples of political infighting and personal agendas. Moving on from the political framework and drilling down to what's revealed as the story progresses, we find a philosophical conflict rather than a moral one. Like Final Fantasy Tactics, there's no distinct line between good versus bad in the macro sense, but rather we see the attempts of one man, Vayne Solidor, trying to break away from a literal and personified notion of predetermined fate and oppression, which is that of the supernatural Occurrier. And conversely, we see the attempts of Princess Ashe, who is chosen by the Fates, trying to avenge and restore her family's status as a royal, using Occurrian artifacts such as the Dawn Shard, the Sun Crest and the Sword of Kings to do so. So, this is quite interesting because we have the twofold conflict of republicanism versus monarchism, but also in tandem to these political conflicts, the ideals of free will embodied by Vayne versus determinism embodied by Ashe and the Ocuria. And this is doubly interesting because it somewhat subverts the common hero versus villain tropes, which sees heroes fighting for freedom against the villainous oppression, which is only the surface level political dispute in Final Fantasy XII, but the larger philosophical war is somewhat debatable, and I've seen numerous comments online over the years that actually argue Vayne is a tragic, misunderstood hero, and Ashe is a mere puppet of these supernatural oppressors that is unwittingly working for the true villains, who are the Ocuria. Now, I won't labour on this point, but I think this aspect of Final Fantasy XII opens into an intriguing philosophical debate, because you could question whether the Ocuria controlling events is inherently bad, or whether Vayne's pursuit of free will is inherently good. Despite their harrowing appearance, could we suppose that the Ocuria are actually virtuous, kindly fates rather than oppressors? And conversely, do the ends really justify the means in Vayne's ruthless pursuit of freedom? And are his intentions even really that pure? Because, of course, he does seek this so-called freedom, but he wishes to do so by becoming a dynast king, which seems like quite a tyrannical, dictatorial thing for him to do. So, the Ocuria themselves, they're not omnipotent, flawless beings, but rather they have their own internal conflicts, much like the gods found in Greek mythology. Their leader, Garun, is manipulating Ashe into seeking power, but conversely the rogue Ocuria, Venat, aligns with Cid and Vayne in the hopes of freeing mankind from his supernatural contemporaries. So, what do we take from all of this? In my opinion, I think it simply means that Final Fantasy XII has a very layered and interpretable conundrum of story that is a fine example of how Matsuno's Ivalice universe operates, and it operates outside of these accepted narrative conventions of good versus bad, and is infinitely more interpretable by fans and players alike. So, while we're on the topic of these central conflicts, it's prudent to mention the recurring square trope of technological innovation disturbing a natural equilibrium. As we've previously seen, the Magitech of Final Fantasy VI, the Mako processing of Final Fantasy VII, the Black Mage constructions of Final Fantasy IX, and the Forbidden Machina of Final Fantasy X, there's always a component of science and technology that threatens or otherwise impacts the world as we know it. In the case of Final Fantasy XII, Venat furnishes Cid with the Nephesite, and subsequently the knowledge of how to synthesize Nephesite, and thus the threat of technology through its manipulation of nature is once again explored uniquely through the secondary antagonist of Dr. Cid. So let's take a step forward from the macro events here and focus on the characters that comprise our party. Much like Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII deals subtly with the idea of class, and our main party originate in different places within the political spectrum and the social strata of Ivalice. And incidentally, most characters in our party have, for whatever reason, been ejected from their established place within the social hierarchy, such as Bash being a disgraced knight, Fran leaving the wood, Vaan being orphaned. Each are outcast into this motley group that muddles through the game events together. So, first of the characters that I'd like to discuss is the somewhat controversial character of Vaan, because being an Aladdin-esque street urchin, he's the lowest denomination on the social spectrum and represents the poverty-stricken, oppressed people of the Damascan peasantry. As such, he's a window into the culture and the fallout of the turbulent authoritarian society, through which the player develops an immediate idea of how war, and by extension the Arcadian occupation, has negatively impacted the people of Dalmasca, and specifically Rabanastra. His role as a peasant also permits him to be something of a window for the player into the larger political events of the game, because much like Tidus from Final Fantasy X, he's an outsider, and so his education in the events taking place are simultaneously the player's education into the events taking place, which is quite a useful narrative device, I think, particularly when we get into the higher level politics, concerning Ashe and the Ocuria and Vayne. Now, the controversial aspect of Vaan is that, despite Final Fantasy XII being intended as an ensemble story, he seems to be posited as more of a central character, particularly by way of us controlling him so often. Unlike Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy IX, which from the very outset shifts the player control through various characters and situations, such as controlling Vivi, Zidane and Steiner, all within the opening 15 minutes of Final Fantasy IX. 12 sees a very quick onboarding sequence where we play as Rex, before shifting to control Vaan for the majority of the game time. So the focus on Vaan is controversial with some fans because many feel that his relevance to the core story and political machinations and vendettas between Ashe and Vayne and Bash and Gabranth is quite minimal. And while he does of course have an axe to grind in avenging the death of his brother, this scenario is somewhat detached from the macro events that unfold, and arguably they only propel him so far into the story for someone who's the most controlled character in the story. By comparison, we have, going back to Tidus from Final Fantasy X, he's a similar window into events sort of character, but his role in the story actually shifts the entire course of Final Fantasy X's trajectory. He changes Yuna's pilgrimage to one of destroying sin rather than placating it. He also has a defining love story in the game and a resolution with his absent father, Jecht. So his role as the player character and the hero is clearly defined and closely associated with events, whereas Vaan's arguably is not. And indeed, it's Bash who has the resolution with an absent brother in the conclusion of Final Fantasy XII. This controversy has also been amplified by the fact Square developers have come out and quite bluntly stated that Bash was intended to be the hero character, but he was later replaced because he was considered too old for the game's target demographic to relate to, and the fact that Vaan was written purely as a response to a marketing team trying to appeal to a specific audience to gain sales, rather than being an integral, organic aspect of the story, have led many to dismiss him as a superficial addition and a gimmicky sort of character. Now, for my part, on the one hand, I can understand these sentiments, and creating a character with the intention to sell something rather than as a part of a cohesive artistic narrative does bother me on some level, and there are moments where Vaan's presence in events does stick out somewhat. But really, taking a step back and considering him simply as a character in an ensemble rather than one that's been given the spotlight, I think he does work quite well as a personality and a contribution to the party. As previously mentioned, him and Penelo represent an important aspect of the social climate by being orphans forced towards thievery. He also brings that boundless optimism and humorous naivety to bear, which can only come from an aspirational teenager sort of character, and it contrasts very well with Bash's severity and Ashe's royal propriety, I think. There's some humorous transactions between Vaan and his female companions too, where he asks some quite unseemly questions, oblivious to the fact that he's speaking to a lady, or indeed royalty. A particularly good one is where he asks Fran her age and gets a very frosty response, which indicates his complete lack of social awareness. The fact that Vaan also aspires to be a sky pirate complements his exchanges with Balthier too, as the latter, in many ways, embodies precisely what Vaan wishes to become. And there's some nice moments, such as Vaan laying eyes upon the airship for the first time, that injects some light-hearted personality into the game that otherwise is fraught with quite severe political turmoil. Now, I noted Rex earlier, and part of Vaan's story is the fact we witness his brother's murder at the hands of Gabranth at the beginning of the game, and much like Cypher being inspired to become a knight due to Laguna's movie in Final Fantasy VIII, this is a small, separated event that loosely draws Vaan into the central plotline with some central antagonists. Personally, the plot didn't necessarily warrant this angle for his character, as his contempt for Arcadia could have been initiated by his social circumstance, or indeed, he could have simply stayed as an opportunistic thief that fell in with Balthier. Perhaps he didn't warrant this tragic backstory. But much like Zidane from Final Fantasy IX and Locke from Final Fantasy VI, Square have often felt compelled to give the happy-go-lucky character a tragic past to try and authenticate and set up their future conflict. That wraps up my thoughts on Vaan. I think he's a great character and an asset to the game, with some humorous dialogue and teenage naivety to liven up the severity of the more dramatic party members. I believe he was simply a secondary character who was misrepresented and poorly positioned by the developers as a central protagonist in what should either have been a completely and overtly ensemble story, or possibly Ashe's or Bash's story, which has subsequently tarnished some people's opinions of the game and this character to this day. Now, turning to Penelo, I think that once again, to appreciate this character, we need to consider the game as an ensemble cast, representative of a collective good, rather than a set of characters with intricate dramas to contend with, such as we saw play out in games like Final Fantasy VII, wherein every member of the party has an axe to grind against Shinra. Rather than having some deep-seated trauma to work out and resolve, Penelo is actually entirely averse to adventure, revenge, or stepping out of line at the beginning of the game. The death of her parents leave her in fear of Arcadian oppression, so rather than being the classic gung-ho girl child, such as Yuffie in 7 or Selphie from 8, or Eiko in 9, Penelo is a much more risk-averse and measured member of the party, and her entire reason for going along in the first place is to try and impose this common sense and cautious approach on her gung-ho friend Vaan. So Penelo's quite interesting because she tends to avoid the conventional trappings of a young female Final Fantasy lead. She's not particularly held up as a love interest or a mischievous girl child or a femme fatale, but rather she's a much more moralising and maternal figure that has some decisive interactions with Vaan and later Larsa that contribute to the game's humanising of the politics and war that we find ourselves in. And this is important because by not being out for revenge or redemption, or for any sort of noble personal agenda, Penelo is able to gauge things beyond political, personal or ideological boundaries, and comfortably, is able to sit with Larsa, a supposed enemy, which is an important part of the game that helps elaborate on the perceptions of Arcadia and House Solidor, because Larsa of course feels that he's striving to help people, and it immediately humanises elements of these supposed foes and begins to isolate Vayne as a clearly rogue and despotic leader. So it's a classic Matsuno narrative device that, much like Tactics before it, doesn't divide characters into clearly defined categories of good and bad, but offers shades of grey to everything, which, despite Final Fantasy XII changing hands with writers and directors late on, still shine through at intervals, thanks to characters such as Penelo and Larsa kind of coming together with these dialogues. Now, as we've noted, Penelo is somewhat divorced from the macro politics of Final Fantasy XII, and more cynical fans would argue she's less relevant to the plot, even than Vaan. But for my part, I think Penelo is perfectly placed because she's never been given undue exaggeration as a central character, but nor has she ever proved completely irrelevant, as the aforementioned micro-story arc with Larsa plays to her character's strengths and contributes to the game story in a small but quite significant way. It's not out of character for Penelo, of all the party members, to emote with Larsa in such positive terms, and I don't think she's actively detrimental to the game by featuring so marginally either. Indeed, part of the fun of Final Fantasy is having a motley group of characters that join forces for some broad, collective reason, and while many in the past have criticised characters like Penelo, Eiko or Red 13 for being irrelevant, I think they're actually part of the personality and fun that these fellowship quests are supposed to be about. Let's turn now to discuss Basch von Rosenberg, who, in many ways and in many people's eyes, can be considered a central character or protagonist in Final Fantasy XII. True enough, Square originally intended him as such, and his connection to the central story through his animosity with his brother, Judge Gabranth, his tested loyalties with comrades such as Vossler, and his redemption tale as a fallen knight, is a much stronger narrative thread than Vaan or most other party members, excusing perhaps Ashe. But Basch was relegated to something of a strong, wizened support role, along the lines of Auron in Final Fantasy X or Cid in Final Fantasy VII, as he equates to this strange Squaresoft logic of elder characters equaling wisdom and thus secondary status. So, for my part, Basch is among my favourite characters, simply because he slots into this convention, like Auron from Final Fantasy X, and other similar wizened characters, such as Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, for example. By which I mean, he has a much more severe demeanour and a complex past to contend with, which conveys a sense of history and angst, and contrasts with the happy-go-lucky vibes of Vaan, the self-involved escapism of Fran and Balthier, and the quest for the throne of Ashe. Indeed, for all intents and purposes, Vaan and Basch share the same personality traits of the archetypal hero character. They are loyal, they fight the good fight, they defend the weak, and have a strong moral compass. It's simply a fact that one is the naive, optimistic teenager, and Basch is the brooding guy with loads of personal baggage to contend with, which, in my opinion, gives him the edge in terms of interest and relevance to the final story. So, turning now to Princess Ashe, we encounter another candidate for lead character status. Much like Bash, she sits somewhat awkwardly on the periphery of player control, but at the same time propels the story through much of its core scenarios on her quest towards the Suncrist, the Dusk Shard, and other such archaic trinkets that help ratify her status as a Damascan heir. She's an interesting example of how female characters were taking an increasingly assertive role in Square games, which started with the headstrong Princess Garnet in Final Fantasy IX, persisted with Yuna in Final Fantasy X, and particularly its sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, and would be fully realised with the character of Lightning in Final Fantasy XIII. So Ashe is this interesting middle ground between the genuine female lead to come and the increasingly forthright, assertive and non-sexualised, non-damsel-in-distress females that had featured in previous Square games. Now, as I alluded to earlier in the review, the Ivalice games play with the notions of good and bad, and are much more ideologically driven and interpretable stories, rather than conventionally moral ones. As such, Ashe's quest to return to the throne, which by its nature is a monarchical hierarchy dependent on ideas of determinism, fate, and the divine right of kings, is completely at odds with Vayne Solidor's pursuit of freedom and self-determinism, which is realised by destroying the aforementioned reliance on gods, in this case the Orcuria, and this hereditary fate and determinism, which he perceives as enslaving the worlds of men. So, on a philosophical level, how do we feel about this? Because if we suppose the ideals of self-determinism and freedom are good, then by extension are Ashe's actions at the behest of these puppeteering gods, by extension, bad? And do they make Vayne's intentions and actions, though extreme and tyrannical, by default good? Well, I'll admit to playing devil's advocate somewhat with this. My point is that the Ivalice games are great because they work in shades of grey. You could argue that despite their omnipotent control, the Orcuria are actually good because they're trying to avoid a horrific war through their champion Ashe. But at the same time, they try to encourage Ashe to commit genocide against Arcadia, which is doubtless full of innocent citizens, in order to eradicate Vernat. I've seen others argue, conversely, that Vayne acts ruthlessly because he wants Larsa to rule peaceably after he's gone. So Vayne's basically doing the dirty work. Although I'd say the actions of the endgame ultimately dismiss this, but the dichotomy and conflicted ideology between Ashe and the perceived antagonist Vayne is what I find interesting and alluring about this central thread of story that she very much dictates. Now, Final Fantasy games often attribute a fated aspect to its female leads, and they are often found to commune with the gods or ancient beings. You know, Terra in 6 is a half Esper, Ares in 7 is an ancient, Rinoa in 8 is a sorceress, Garnet is a summoner, and Yuna is also a summoner. Being one of the few games of Final Fantasy's post-SNES installments not to hinge heavily around the summons, and owing to its eradication of predefined classes in favour of full customization, 12 required another aspect of story to imbue its female lead with. But, much like these other titles, there is a communion with godly creatures featured heavily in the female lead storyline. In this instance, it ties back to this notion of good and bad, owing to Ashe's inheritance and wielding of the deified Nethicite, which is basically the atom bomb of Ivalice, at the behest of the Orcurian gods. What we find is several moments when it could have gone either way with regards to Ashe's moral compass, and it's up to the wider party and do-gooder, morally astute characters like Vaan, Bash and Balthier to convince Ashe not to utilise the Orcurian weapons, which is a good debate to have taken place, and I think should have been dialed up slightly to produce some more conflict within the party and some better developed opinions and characterizations, within the game. But suffice to say, Ashe, much like Delita in Final Fantasy Tactics, is a very interesting character because she holds the fate of nations in her hands, and the question of whether the ends justify the means, and whether the obscure line between justice and revenge will be crossed, is something that persists and conflicts in her for a good deal of the game. And the relevance of the party, and particularly Vaan, I think, gradually and thankfully see her take the high road. So, wrapping up, a great evolution of the female lead in a Square game, from a timid, character-reliant male counterpart, as we saw in earlier games, to Ashe, who is a headstrong, highly independent individual that has internal political conflicts to deal with, rather than some prevalent love story, which is a welcome break from the norm, I think. Moving on to discuss Balthier now. He's another character that some regard as a hero to the story, and while I personally don't feel his centrality is on a par with Ashe, he is certainly inadvertently tied to events more than initially thought, and he has a couple of reveals with the discovery that the eccentric secondary antagonist Dr. Cid is his father, and also his former life as an Arcadian judge. Now, unlike Ashe or Ashe, who are fighting to restore their past status, Balthier is quite to the contrary, fighting to escape his past. He feels a degree of shame about both his father and his role as a high-ranking Arcadian official, and tends to disguise this with a pomp and theatrical charisma that tends to make fans either really like or really dislike him. But on this note, I think Balthier is quite amusing, considering his narcissism and opinion of himself is quite misguided. He frequently refers to himself as the leading man, when quite clearly he's an accessory to a wider story, and the one who wields the Nephesite, Ashe, and her wayward counterpoint, Vayne, are clearly the central figures through whom peace or calamity is ultimately determined. However, considering the ensemble leanings of the party, it's amusing that Balthier would try to steal the limelight too, because much like his flamboyant attire and jewellery, he's a sky pirate that basks in attention and adulation from others in a light-hearted, tongue-in-cheek sort of way, and so slots in at intervals to lighten the mood. For my part, I think Balthier is a good character, not for his charismatic demeanour or dramatic past, but actually because he's much more of a measured party member, given to pragmatism and common sense survival instincts that generally avoid some fatal decisions that other characters tend to make based on their ideals of truth or justice or revenge. Balthier's inclination towards fight or flight, live and let live, indifference towards irrelevant issues, and sober decision-making is often overlooked by his flamboyance and self-indulgent dialogue. But for me, it's these attributes that make him a valued asset to the story, rather than any of his more superficial attributes. Regarding his past life as a judge, this seems somewhat poorly developed because, frankly, upon having this revealed in a passing conversation with Ashe, nothing much is done with it as far as the story goes. We could argue his background and former station is a great example of nepotism in the Arcadian regime and exemplifies how Balthier has clearly led quite a privileged life. However, his haunted past and relationship to his father is used as a more cautionary tale aspect, intended to show Ashe the dangers of falling into an obsessive pursuit. It's telling that even in the encounters with Dr. Cid, not much is resolved or revealed regarding the relationship between these two, to the point that it's arguably quite an unfulfilled or possibly cut story arc. Finally, regarding unfulfilled feelings, it seems at regular intervals the player is baited with dialogue and innuendo that there's some amorous feelings between Balthier and Fran, and much subsequent speculation has emerged about the nature of this bizarre interspecies relationship. I don't personally have an opinion on the matter myself, but suffice to say, Balthier's use of innuendo, more questionable dialogue, such as stating Fran doesn't like to be tied up, is quite hilarious. But whether you'd consider them partners or something more, the dynamic between them, particularly culminating at the top of Pharos towards the end of the game, particularly warming, I think, and enjoyable. So, on that note, let's turn from Balthier to Fran now and consider the obligatory non-human character which traditionally blesses the Final Fantasy party. Much like Red 13 from 7, Quina from 9, or Kimari from 10, Fran follows the recurring trope of representing a marginalised or underrepresented and often oppressed race within a given Final Fantasy world. The secretive woodland Viera are one of the multitude of creatures found in Final Fantasy XII, and their enigmatic, intelligent nature, delicate build, and predilection towards bows and arrows see them correlative and, in my opinion, strongly inspired by the elves found in Western folklore, and particularly the sort that are characterised by J.R.R. Tolkien in The Hobbit and his Lord of the Rings series. However, that said, the inspiration for Fran and the Viera may also stem from a more obscure Japanese origin too, and while this is purely my speculative, subjective observation, there's a 90s anime show called Outlaw Star, which was somewhat obscured and forgotten due to the similar but newer and flashier series Cowboy Bebop, and it hinged around space pirates and also featured a strange cat-like creature called Ashe Clan, who was partially sexualized but overtly a violent sky pirate who leaves her homeworld in search of redemption. And this character looks remarkably similar to Fran, and on top of this, when angered, Ashe would also go uncontrollably berserk and transform into a beast against her will, which once again runs parallels with Fran's reaction to the mist during the events of Final Fantasy XII, and it made me wonder if their research into popular Sky Pirate franchises might have led Square to this obscure 90s curio. Anyway, turning to the events of Final Fantasy XII, Fran proves quite an unobtrusive and reserved sort of character. She speaks when she feels it's necessary and works with the same pragmatism that Balthier has, and it makes them work quite well as a duo, I think. I touched on this whole ambiguous relationship episode with Balthier, but personally I like the ambiguity of it, and I like that Balthier and Fran prioritise a certain professionalism over it, if indeed it is the case, and a certain amount of wit and banter about it too. Again, it's simply a good example of good writing, and overt romance is simply not a component of the Ivalice games, so I'm quite glad it wasn't indulged too much by the developers. Furthermore, owing to the ambiguity of it, people are still very much talking about it to this day, much like the Rinoa Ultimecia question. So for me, that's just compelling narrative, that it can last and be discussed for so many years. Now, I've discussed freedom with regards to Final Fantasy XII, and mostly so in a political and philosophical sense. Self-determinism ousting archaic godly forces is a governing idea behind the game, and through her personal story arc, Fran embodies these ideas of free will and the personal cost entailed in her relationship to the wood. As someone who sought personal freedom and left her homeland, we find Fran is no longer able to hear or speak to the forest, and her own people consider her an outcast. So this is an interesting reflection of the central themes here, but what I find frustrating about Fran is that, beyond this vague notion of quote marks freedom, we don't really know what she aspires towards. It begs the question, why did Fran leave in the first place? And now that she has left, what does she want? There's little explanation here, which is unfortunate, and unlike the closest numerical game to feature an ensemble cast, Final Fantasy IX, there's no large chunks of cutscene or game time that's really dedicated to fleshing out respective characters, like we see with Vivi, Steiner, Zidane or Freya. So, although I like Fran, she is a distinctly unknowable component. I suppose this lends greatly to her mystique and appeal throughout Final Fantasy XII, but depending on how you look at it, could ultimately prove a disappointment when we don't get so much story out of her. So, discussing Final Fantasy XII would not be complete without delving into the forces that contend the peace and equilibrium that the player party strives towards, and I think we can identify 3 significant villains that are uniquely tied to 3 heroic counterparts on a personal level and the wider antagonistic events on a macro level. Firstly, we have Dr. Cid, who I'd argue is tertiary to the action, but is significant in terms of fathering Balthier, which ties him to the party on a personal level, but more so his importance, which is due to the technological innovations such as airships, weaponry, and manufactured nethicite. To this end, he's much like Hojo from Final Fantasy VII, who, rather than being overtly evil, is simply consumed by an amoral pursuit of scientific discovery and technological marvel. Cid's also significant as he's the bridge between the rogue or courier Venat and the worlds of men, and one of the more interesting personality traits I find with him is that where we early on think that he's talking to himself and probably quite insane, he's actually conversing with the invisible Venat, who reveals itself at the Draclaw laboratory. Beyond Cid, we have the man I'd consider the secondary antagonist due to his proximity to the central story, which is Gabranth. The murderer of Ramanas, Rex, and the ruthless twin of Bash, it's safe to say he's tied to and affects our heroes on a personal level, being directly responsible for the deaths of family members, prompting them into the action at the beginning of the game. As such, Gabranth is an interesting guy and probably warrants an episode of his own, because much like Cypher from Final Fantasy VIII, or Zalbag from Final Fantasy Tactics, he has a fierce sense of loyalty, but it's simply offered to forces that contend with the ideals of the main party. He's certainly ruthless and morally wayward in many ways, but many of his actions are interpretable depending on player opinion, and the apex of his story arc sees an attempt at redemption through self-sacrifice, which is contrary to many of his earlier actions, particularly the execution of Judge Drace, who he reluctantly murders to placate a suspicious Vayne. So, much to consider around Gabranth that I'm interested to throw open as a discussion point, because some people love him, some people hate him, and I think there's equal evidence to support both of these opinions. Now, however, I want to shift focus onto Vayne, who is ultimately the antagonist we primarily face down, and as I've alluded to, his status as a villain could be debated in a broad philosophical sense, which is one of the intrigues of Vayne, and how, despite him rarely cracking the top 5 of people's favourite villains, where he's up against personalities like Kefka and Sephiroth, he persists for me as one of the most interesting Final Fantasy antagonists I've encountered. Broadly speaking, Vayne's motives throughout the game are to emancipate mankind from the Okurian gods, who determine the fates of worlds and men, and to use Vayne's words, he wants to allow man to keep his own history, and on the surface at least, this is Vayne's argument for his actions throughout the course of the game. Now, taking this at face value, the pursuit of free will and self-determinism is an overtly noble cause. Nobody likes to be dictated to or puppeteered at the whims of gods and fate, but many dissenters of Vayne feel that this noble agenda to give man the reins of history is merely a ruse to install himself as a tyrannical dictator in the form of the Dynast King so that he can essentially rule the world. So, with this in mind, and in keeping with notions of intention and ideology, there's 2 ways we can interpret Vayne's actions, and I'd like to do so by comparing him with 2 distinctly different Roman leaders, which is a civilization and a political system that I think Arcadia and Final Fantasy XII borrows from quite heavily. Firstly, if we were to consider Vayne of a fundamentally good-natured demeanour, genuinely wishing to reclaim power for the benefit of mankind and future generations, we could compare him to General Lucius Sulla, who was one of the most prestigious, skilled and controversial generals and politicians of the Roman Republic. Now, during Sulla's lifetime, there was a lot of corruption and political infighting within the Senate that echoed out into the provinces and gradually threatened the stability of Rome. Sulla, who was just concluding a campaign in Greece and backed by an extremely loyal army, did what was basically unspeakable and unprecedented at the time, which was to march his legions across the Rubicon River, which was a symbolic marker on the outskirts of the capital, which no army was supposed to cross, and into the city of Rome to take control. Sulla did this twice in his lifetime and was made dictator of Rome, during which time he rigorously rooted out corruption, sorted out the Senate, and, for all intents and purposes, made things better. What is so remarkable about this guy, however, is that once he'd achieved all of these things, he handed power back to the Senate and stepped down into retirement, which simply isn't what history or most examples of a dictatorship shows men to do. And indeed, the term dictator, which today has connotations with fascism and evil, is actually a Roman idea which simply means leadership being temporarily handed to a single magistrate, particularly during times of war, during which they make the rules. And it's very similar to the tyrants of ancient Greece, which has equally taken on a negative connotation. Turning to Vayne, those that empathise with him generally see him along these lines, which is that he does everything overtly ruthlessly and violent and, tyrannically, he does these evil things, or questionable things, but he does it in order to improve the world, make it better, and hand it back to mankind, and perhaps to his brother Larsa, in a better state than how he inherited it. Those that argue Vayne is evil, however, point to his narcissistic desire to be Dynast King, his ruthless murders, including patricide, his disregard for the Senate, and the stoking of war, as evidence, that he's basically out for himself under the guise of some metaphysical conquest and revolution in the name of mankind. And this is where the term dictator takes its more common negative connotation, and much like Julius Caesar, who shortly after Sulla installed himself as the consul of Rome and re-established the Roman dynasty of emperors, starting with his nephew Caesar Augustus, it's arguable that Vayne never intends to hand back control, but rather install himself indefinitely as the leader of men. So, turning to our second Roman leader I'd like to compare Vayne to, which is not Julius Caesar, but Emperor Nero, I find the negative perception of Vayne runs parallels with this guy's reign, which was underpinned by violence, senseless murders and oppression. Nero is renowned for murdering his wives along with his own mother, and was so ruthlessly oppressive that eventually his own Praetorian Guard renounced him and he killed himself before anyone else could. He's also accused of starting the Great Fire of Rome so that he could rebuild the city to his own taste, which owes to his being a strong patron of the arts and very keen on visuals, architecture and aesthetics. Turning to Vayne, we see that he too murders a parent, his rule is underpinned by violent oppression, and eventually his quote marks of Praetorian Guard, or judges, begin to turn against him, culminating in Gabranth's betrayal in the endgame. But where Nero was a patron of the arts, we also see evidence that Vayne is as well. If we look at his opening speech in his first appearance at the beginning of the game, he concludes with an appreciation of Rabanastro's architecture, which shows a refined and cultivated demeanour. And we also see him talking in friendly and disarming terms with Miguelo, the shopkeeper, which contradicts and perhaps conceals the more menacing intentions that lie beneath. So there's two distinct ideas of Vayne that prevail among fans, and I really like both. And for my part, I think that, maybe Vayne is a little bit of both. He probably on some level believes himself when he says he's trying to free mankind. However, the world politic and the desire to win, as it were, eventually blind him to everything else, including his own brother and his end goal. We see him in the final moments where he's willing to kill Larsa, and I'd like to think that Vayne, the man he formerly was, wouldn't have been willing, to do this sort of thing. But once again, owing to Final Fantasy XII infinitely interpretable and murky kind of philosophical and psychological perspectives and events and things like that, I'm open to discussion and I'm open to opinions on Vayne. And as I've said, the reason I like him so much as a villain is that you can interpret him in any number of ways, particularly compared to earlier Final Fantasy antagonists, who have been quite straightforward and understandable in terms of their motives and intentions. So the final thing to touch on with Final Fantasy XII is the music, and in the wake of Nobuo Uematsu, whose last official game was Final Fantasy IX, the helm was taken up by Hitoshi Sakimoto, Masaharu Iwata, both of whom worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, and Hayato Matsuo, who had previous experience working on the Dragon Quest series. Much like Tactics, 12 has a very distinct feel in terms of music, but where Tactics was generally applauded for its music, 12 being a numerical instalment, which I suppose always leads to a comparison with Uematsu, and the bar is set by him. The music was met with slightly more mixed reviews from journalists and fans alike. For my part, I like the soundtrack, and I found the wistful high fantasy leanings of it quite endearing and unique to this title. A prime example being the Dalmasca Esther Sound composition as you're traversing the world map. But on a purely personal level, I did find that the OST blended it into itself somewhat, and I can't particularly pick out any standout pieces or distinct tracks, as I play through the game, beyond the wonderful reworking of the Final Fantasy theme when you first load up the game. So there we have it. Final Fantasy XII is an intriguing example of the unique Ivalice setting and a controversial instalment for many with the introduction of a hero for marketing purposes, its high-level ensemble plotline, and its total overhaul of gameplay, levelling and battle dynamics. Nonetheless, I think its focus on subjective and ideological intentions rather than conventions of good versus evil, its low-key but ruthless villains, and its bold evolution of character customization make it a bold step forward for Square at the tail end of the 6th generation console cycle, and it seems like some very ambitious experiment that paid off for the most part, I think, but left some people quite disgruntled with its departure from JRPG conventions.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.